The silence of the house was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on Silas Blackwood from the moment his eyes opened to the grey pre-dawn light until he surrendered to a fitful sleep. It was the silence of absence, the ghost of laughter that no longer echoed in the rafters, the phantom creak of a rocking chair that now stood perfectly still by the cold hearth. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams that sliced through the grimy window panes, illuminating the vacant space where his wife, Elara, used to sit, her hands a blur of motion with needle and thread. On the mantel, a small, crudely whittled horse, its paint worn from the grip of a tiny hand, was a monument to his son, Thomas. A monument to a fever that had swept through their valley 2 winters past, taking both of them and leaving Silas with nothing but the vast, aching emptiness of the land and the hollowed-out shell of his own heart. His life had been reduced to a litany of chores, a mindless rhythm of splitting wood, drawing water, and mending fences that enclosed nothing he cared for. The sprawling plains, with their stark horizons and indifferent sky, were a perfect mirror for the desolation within him. He was a man adrift in his own life, anchored only by the ghosts of what he had lost. It was a sound that broke the monotony, a scrabbling, frantic noise from behind the cabin. Not the familiar whine of a coyote or the patient scratching of a vulture. This was different. Sharper. More desperate. Silas took the worn Winchester from its pegs by the door, his movements economical and long-practiced. He didn't feel fear, or even curiosity. He felt only a dull annoyance at the intrusion. He rounded the corner of the log-built structure, his boots silent in the thick dust. The scene that met his eyes stopped him cold, a brutal tableau that cut through the thick fog of his grief. 3 children, so thin their bones seemed to push against their filthy skin, were huddled over the half-eaten carcass of a jackrabbit he'd tossed out for the scavengers the day before. They were like a pack of starving wolves, their faces smudged with dirt and blood. The oldest, a girl of maybe 12 with eyes far too old for her face, clutched a sharpened stick. She stood protectively over 2 smaller figures, a boy who looked to be 7 or 8, and a little girl, barely more than a toddler, who was gnawing on a piece of sinew with a desperate intensity. When the oldest girl saw him, she didn't scream. She snarled, a low, feral sound deep in her throat, and raised her pathetic weapon. Her body was a taut line of defiance, shielding the others from the new threat. Silas looked at them, and for the first time in 2 years, he saw something other than the ghosts of Elara and Thomas. He saw the fierce, protective glare of the girl and remembered Elara defending her garden from a stray bull. He saw the wide, terrified eyes of the boy and remembered Thomas after a nightmare. He saw the small, vulnerable form of the youngest and his heart fractured all over again. The Winchester in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He lowered it slowly, the motion deliberate so as not to spook them. They watched him, their small bodies trembling, poised for flight or a fight they could not possibly win. He said nothing. Words were useless things, clumsy and loud. Instead, he backed away, his gaze never leaving the defiant girl. He went inside the cabin, the oppressive silence now replaced by the frantic beating of his own heart. He took a whole loaf of day-old bread from the larder and filled his own canteen with fresh, cool water from the bucket. He walked back to the corner of the cabin and placed the offerings on a large, flat stump a dozen yards from where they hid. Then he retreated to his porch, sinking into his chair and watching. For a long time, nothing happened. The plains wind whispered through the dry grass. Then, like a flicker of movement at the edge of vision, the oldest girl crept forward. She snatched the bread and canteen and scurried back to the others. He could hear the tearing of the loaf, the frantic gulping of water. He watched from the shadows of his porch as they devoured his offering, their hunger a raw, terrible thing to witness. He sat there until the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the same colors he and Elara used to watch together. A question burned in his mind, fierce and unwelcome. Could he simply watch them fade back into the wilderness that had swallowed his own happiness, or was he bound, by some unspoken law of the heart, to intervene? The sun dipped below the earth, and in the deepening twilight, Silas remained on his porch, a lone sentinel caught between the ghosts of his past and the desperate, living specters huddled just beyond the walls of his home. The days that followed fell into a new, unspoken rhythm. Silas would rise, perform his morning chores, and then leave a plate of food on the stump. Scrambled eggs and biscuits, a bowl of thick stew, a slab of salted pork. He never tried to approach. He never spoke. He would leave the offering and retreat to the porch or the barn, granting them the illusion of solitude. He learned to watch them without watching, to track their movements through the shifting of shadows and the rustle of brush. They were like a trio of wary fawns, their senses tuned to the slightest hint of danger. The oldest, who he came to think of as Leah, was their leader, their fierce protector. Her eyes, chips of hard, grey flint, missed nothing. She was the first to the food, always tasting it before allowing the others to eat. The boy, Caleb, was a ghost. He flitted between the trees and the dilapidated shed at the edge of the property, a phantom who vanished whenever Silas's gaze lingered too long. It was the little one, Anna, who showed the first crack in their collective armor of fear. She would sometimes venture a few feet from their hiding place, her tiny head cocked to one side as she watched him split logs, her expression one of pure, unfiltered curiosity. He started talking to them, his voice low and rough from disuse, aimed not at them directly but at the world around them. Storms coming in from the west, he'd murmur to the sky, stacking wood. Grounds thirsty, he never expected a response, and he never received one. The words were for himself as much as for them, a way to fill the crushing silence. He decided to mend the section of fence near the grove of cottonwoods where they often took shelter. It was a pointless task, he had no cattle left to contain. But it gave him a reason to be near them, to let them grow accustomed to his presence. He worked slowly, his movements measured and predictable. He dug new post holes, stretched the wire taut, his calloused hands working with a familiar, steady competence. Leah watched him for hours from the deep shade of the trees, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of unyielding suspicion. She was judging him, weighing his every action. Was this a prelude to a trap? Was this kindness a currency for some future, terrible payment? One afternoon, he went into the cabin and opened the heavy cedar chest at the foot of his bed. The scent of dried lavender and elara filled the air, a sweet, painful memory. He pulled out her old sewing basket, the wicker worn smooth by her touch, and a bolt of soft, blue calico cloth she had never gotten the chance to use. He placed them on the porch steps, next to a bowl of fresh-picked wild berries, and went about his work. He didn't look back. The next morning, as the sun crested the hills, he saw it. A flash of blue. Anna was wearing a crudely stitched but clean dress, the vibrant color a stark contrast to the drab landscape and her own grime-streaked face. Leah had mended the rags of her own clothes and Caleb's, too. A small, silent transaction had occurred. A stitch of trust had been sewn. That night, the storm he had predicted arrived. It wasn't just rain, it was a gale, a furious assault of wind and water that lashed the plains. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and sheets of rain hammered the roof of the cabin. Silas sat by the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He thought of them out there, in their thin clothes, huddled in the inadequate shelter of the trees. He imagined their fear, their cold. It was a thought he could not endure. Getting up, he walked to the door and opened it wide, letting the wind and rain whip inside. He placed a bright lantern on the table just inside the threshold, a beacon in the tempest. Then he returned to his rocking chair, leaving the door agape, an invitation. An hour passed. Then another. The storm raged, and he began to think they had chosen the elements over the unknown danger of his four walls. Just as he was about to concede, a flicker of movement in the doorway. They stood there, framed by the raging night, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. Leah's hair was plastered to her face, and in her small hand, she clutched a heavy, jagged rock. Her eyes dared him. Silas didn't move from his chair. He simply nodded toward the hearth. "Fire's warm," he said, the words nearly swallowed by the wind. Leah hesitated, her gaze darting around the small cabin, assessing every shadow for a threat. Finally, the cold one. She pulled the two younger children inside, nudging them toward the life-giving heat. Silas got up and closed the door, shutting out the storm. He retrieved 3 thick wool blankets from the cedar chest and laid them on the floor near the fire, then retreated to his chair. He didn't offer them food. He didn't ask their names. He simply gave them space and warmth. As the night wore on and the storm subsided to a low grumble, their shivering ceased. They fell asleep, huddled together on one of the blankets, their small bodies finally at peace. Silas didn't go to his bed. He sat in the rocking chair, his old rifle laid across his lap, and watched them. It was not a gesture of threat, but a promise. He was the guardian of this space now, and whatever terrors the world held, they would not cross his threshold tonight. For the first time since Elara and Thomas were gone, the silence of the cabin was filled not with absence, but with the soft, steady sound of breathing. A fragile peace settled over the small ranch, as delicate as a spider's web in the morning dew. The children did not leave. They inhabited the cabin like small, quiet ghosts, their presence a constant, low hum beneath the surface of Silas's solitary existence. He cooked for them, simple, hearty meals of oatmeal, beans, and cornbread. At first, they ate on the floor by the hearth, their backs to him, but slowly, tentatively, they began to take seats at the heavy wooden table where his own family had once shared their meals. Leah was the last to join, her wariness a tangible thing. She became the silent keeper of the domestic space, washing the tin plates with a fierce, possessive energy, sweeping the floor with brisk, angry strokes as if battling back the dirt of her past. She rarely spoke to Silas, communicating instead through sharp glances and reluctant nods. Caleb, the boy, began to emerge from his shell of fear. He started to shadow Silas on his daily rounds, a small, silent apprentice. He would stand at a respectful distance, his eyes wide and observant, as Silas repaired a leather harness or sharpened an axe blade. He never asked questions, but his small hands would mimic the motions, his face a study in deep concentration. One afternoon, while Caleb watched him work, Silas took a small block of pine and his whittling knife and, with a few deft cuts, carved a rough but recognizable songbird. That evening, as the children slept by the fire, he quietly placed the wooden bird on the blanket next to Anna. The next morning, he watched as she woke. Her small fingers closed around the carving, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across her face. It was the first true smile he had seen on any of them, a small sunbeam piercing the gloom. The first true crack in their silence came not from a smile, but from a scream. One night, a piercing shriek ripped through the cabin. Silas was out of his chair in an instant, his heart pounding. Caleb was thrashing in his sleep, his face slick with sweat, his cries filled with pure terror. "No. Not him. Don't let him take me." Leah was there at once, gathering the trembling boy into her arms, her voice a fierce, protective whisper. "Shush, Caleb. He's not here. You're safe. I won't let him get you." She rocked him gently, her own small body a shield against the unseen horrors of his dream. "He'll find us," Caleb sobbed into her shoulder. "Cain always finds us." The name hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Cain. It wasn't just the wilderness they were running from. It wasn't just hunger. Their fear had a name and a face. Silas retreated to the shadows of the room, the knowledge settling in his gut like a cold stone. He was not just sheltering orphans, he was harboring fugitives. The fragile peace he had begun to cultivate was built on a fault line, and the name Cain was the tremor that signaled an inevitable, violent quake. The knowledge changed things. His role as a provider shifted to that of a protector, a more dangerous and definitive position. The next few days were filled with a new kind of tension, an unspoken understanding of the threat that lay somewhere out on the horizon. Silas began to teach Caleb small, useful things, how to properly stack firewood so it would dry, how to read the clouds for weather, how to tie a knot that wouldn't slip. He was giving the boy more than chores, he was giving him skills, a sense of purpose. It was during one of these quiet lessons that the world shifted on its axis. Silas was showing Caleb how to arrange kindling in the wood box when Anna, who had been watching them from the doorway, toddled over. She clutched the wooden bird in one hand, its surface now smooth from her constant touch. She stumbled on an uneven floorboard and Silas instinctively put out his hand to steady her. She looked at his large, calloused hand, then up at his grim, bearded face. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, her own tiny hand reached out and took his. He helped her over the threshold, his touch gentle. She stood before him, looking up into his eyes, her own gaze clear and trusting. And then she spoke, her voice small but carrying the weight of a revelation. "I'll be good, Papa." The word, Papa, struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. It was a ghost on her lips, a name he thought he would never hear again. It bypassed every wall he had ever built, every defense he had erected around his shattered heart. An avalanche of memory and pain and a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope crashed over him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He could only look down at this tiny child who had, with a single word, claimed him. He squeezed her hand, a single, convulsive motion, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. At that moment, the future felt real, a tangible thing he could hold in his hand. But as he looked up, past the child, through the open cabin door, his gaze settled on the distant horizon. A rider. A lone figure on horseback, moving steadily, deliberately, across the plains. He was not a neighbor. He was not lost. He was heading directly for them. Silas's hand fell from Anna's, moving instinctively to the cold, heavy butt of the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. The storm named Cain was coming. The rider was not Cain, but he was his herald. Sheriff Brody was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, a man more concerned with the ink on a piece of paper than the blood in a man's veins. He dismounted without ceremony, his eye sweeping over the cabin, the neatly stacked firewood, and landing on Silas with a flat, indifferent gaze. He did not offer a greeting. "Silas," he said, his voice as dry as the dust at his feet. "Got a notice for you." He pulled a folded document from his bag. "Man by the name of Jedediah Cain. Landowner from over in Stone Creek County. Filed a claim. Seems you're harboring his property." Brody's eyes flickered toward the cabin door, where the pale faces of the children were just visible in the shadows. Silas's posture didn't change, but a cold stillness settled over him. "They ain't property," he stated. It wasn't a debate, it was a declaration of fact. The sheriff shrugged, unimpressed. "The law says different. Says they're indentured to him. He paid off their father's debts. Got the papers right here, all signed and sealed. Says he's coming to collect them tomorrow at noon." He held out the paper. Silas ignored it. "You tell Cain he ain't welcome on this land." Brody's lips tightened into a thin line of annoyance. "That ain't your decision to make, Silas. The law is the law. You hand him over peaceful like when he comes, or I'll have to come back with deputies and take him myself. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He mounted his horse, the leather creaking in the tense silence. "Noon tomorrow," he repeated, then turned and rode away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The next morning dawned heavy and gray, the sky a bruised purple. A nervous energy filled the cabin. Leah sharpened a kitchen knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone setting Silas's teeth on edge. Caleb stayed close to the window, a small, silent scout. Anna clung to Silas's leg, her face buried in his trousers. Just before noon, they appeared. 3 riders cresting the hill. The man in the center was Jedediah Cain. He was exactly as Silas had imagined, well-dressed in a dark coat and hat, astride a fine black horse that danced nervously beneath him. He had a smug, fleshy face and eyes that scanned the homestead not as a home, but as an inventory of assets. The 2 men flanking him were cut from a rougher cloth, their faces hard and their hands resting near their pistols. They were tools, and Cain was the hand that wielded them. Cain rode up to the porch and stopped, looking down at Silas with an air of supreme arrogance. "Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and laced with contempt. "I hear you found something of mine." Behind Silas, Leah made a small, choked sound, a mix of hatred and terror. Cain's eye slid past Silas to her. A greasy smile spread across his face. "Ah, there's the little Spitfire. Getting to be a big girl, ain't she? Old enough to be of use in other ways now." The insinuation was a lit match dropped on dry tinder. In that instant, Silas saw Ilara's face, he saw Thomas's smile, and he saw the innocence of the 3 children behind him. The grief in his heart finally finished its transformation, hardening from a brittle ache into cold, unyielding steel. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "They're not yours to claim," Cain chuckled, a short, ugly sound. "I paid good money for them. That makes them mine. Their labor belongs to me until their father's debt is settled. The law's on my side, old man." Silas's gaze was unwavering. "The law ain't on this land today." Cain's smile vanished. "Is that so?" He gave a subtle nod to his men. They dismounted slowly, their movements predatory as they spread out, creating a deadly triangle with Silas at its center. The world seemed to shrink to the space of the front yard, the vast plains becoming a claustrophobic arena. "Leah," Silas said, his voice calm but absolute, not taking his eyes off Cain. "Take the others inside. Bolt the door. And don't you open it. For no one. You hear me?" For a second, the girl's defiant nature flared. She looked from Silas to Cain, her knuckles white where she gripped the doorframe. Then she saw the look in Silas's eyes, a look that promised violence, and she obeyed. She grabbed Caleb and Anna, pulling them back into the darkness of the cabin. The heavy thud of the bolt sliding home echoed in the silence. It was just the four of them now. Cain swung down from his horse, pulling a polished revolver from his belt. "I've wasted enough time on you and these brats. Last chance, Blackwood." "Stand aside." Silas didn't move. He simply shifted his weight, his hand hovering over the worn grip of his Colt. The world held its breath. The explosion of violence was not the clean, choreographed dance of saloon legends. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble of noise, smoke, and terror. Cain's men drew first, their movements confident, but Silas had the advantage of terrain and desperation. He dove sideways off the porch an instant before a bullet splintered the wood where he'd been standing. He landed hard in the dust, rolling behind the stone well, the Colt already in his hand. The air cracked again. A chip of stone flew from the well's edge, stinging his cheek. He was no gunslinger, but he was a man who knew his land. He knew every angle, every piece of cover. He fired back, not aiming to kill but to suppress, the roar of his revolver a defiant answer to theirs. He was a rancher, a father, a widower. But today, he was a fortress. One of Cain's men made the mistake of rushing him, trying to flank the well. Silas rose up, his face a mask of grim resolve, and fired. The man grunted, stumbling backward, his face a canvas of pure surprise before he fell and lay still. The second man, seeing his partner fall, became more cautious. He ducked behind the water trough, trading shots with Silas. The world was a blur of acrid smoke and the percussive thunder of gunfire. A searing pain tore through Silas's left shoulder, and his arm went numb. He staggered, leaning against the cold stone of the well, the world tilting for a sickening second. Through the haze of pain, he saw the second man stand up, a triumphant smirk on his face, leveling his pistol for the kill shot. But from the barn, a sound, the sharp crack of the old Winchester. The hired man's smirk dissolved as a red flower bloomed on his chest. He collapsed into the mud of the trough. Silas looked toward the barn. In the dark opening of the hayloft stood Caleb, the rifle, far too large for him, resting on a bale of hay, his face pale and set. The boy had found his courage. The yard fell silent save for the panicked breathing of Cain and the ragged gasps of Silas. Cain, his arrogance shattered, stared at his fallen men, then at the blood-soaking Silas's sleeve, then at the barn. His confidence curdled into a snarl of pure malice. He made a desperate, final gambit. He sprinted for the cabin door, his intention clear and vile, to take the girls, to use them as shields, to reclaim his property by force. "Leah! The bolt!" Silas screamed, his voice raw with pain and fury as he pushed himself off the well and limped after him. Just as Cain's hand reached for the doorknob, the door was thrown open from the inside. Leah stood there, not cowering, but braced for battle. In her hands, she held Silas's heavy, razor-sharp skinning knife, gripping it with both hands, its point aimed at Cain's gut. Her face was no longer that of a terrified child, it was the face of a warrior queen defending her kingdom. "You ain't too chin of them," she spat, her voice trembling but full of venom. Her unexpected, ferocious defiance stunned Cain. He hesitated for a single, fatal heartbeat. It was all the time Silas needed. He crashed into Cain from behind, his good arm wrapping around the man's throat. The two men fell to the porch in a tangle of limbs. Cain's pistol clattered across the wooden planks. It was no longer a gunfight, it was a brutal, elemental struggle. Silas was fueled by 2 years of grief and a new, ferocious love. Cain was fueled by greed and wounded pride. It ended with a final, choked gasp from Cain, and then, stillness. Silence descended once more, profound and absolute. The dust began to settle. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Silas pushed himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest, his shoulder on fire. He stood over Cain's body, his chest heaving. He looked at the carnage, the terrible price of their peace. The cabin door was wide open. Leah stood frozen in the frame, the knife still held before her. Caleb appeared behind her, his eyes huge in his small face. Then, Anna pushed past them. She ran across the yard, her little legs pumping, oblivious to the fallen men. She didn't stop until she reached Silas, wrapping her arms tightly around his leg and burying her face against him. Her small act of faith broke the spell. Leah let the knife clatter to the porch. Caleb slowly walked out and stood beside his sister. Then, Leah followed, her steps hesitant. They didn't cling to him like Anna. They just stood close, an unspoken circle of solidarity around their broken savior. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, a single rider returned. Sheriff Brody. He took in the scene with a long, slow look, the bodies, the blood in the dust, Silas sitting on the porch steps while Leah awkwardly tried to bandage his arm. He saw the children, not hiding, but standing near Silas, their fear replaced by a quiet, fierce loyalty. Brody dismounted and walked over to Cain's body, nudging it with his boot. He looked at the official paper still clutched in his hand, the legal document that declared these children property. He looked at Silas, exhausted and bleeding but resolute. He looked at the family that had been forged in that yard. With a slow, deliberate motion, Sheriff Brody tore the document in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces drift from his fingers into the dust. "Looks to me like Cain and his men tried to rob you," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You were just defending your home." A clear case of self-defense. He turned his gaze to Silas. "Just make sure you bury them deep. I got no reason to come back out this way again." Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off, a lone figure disappearing into the twilight, leaving them to the quiet aftermath. As dusk settled, painting the vast sky in soft, healing colors, Silas finally sat in Alara's rocking chair. It didn't feel empty anymore. Anna was asleep in his lap, her small hand clutching the wooden bird. On the steps below, Caleb was trying to whittle a piece of scrap wood with a dull knife, his brow furrowed in concentration. And Leah stood beside the chair, her hand resting on its worn wooden back, a silent, steadying presence. The great, oppressive silence of the plains was gone, replaced by the gentle rhythm of the rocking chair, the soft sound of a child's breathing, and the quiet promise of a new day. The camera of the mine pulls back, showing the small, warm light of the cabin against the immense, dark landscape, no longer a monument to loss, but a beacon of a family, broken and battered, but finally, irrevocably, home.